My life was as predictable as a good book. Quiet chapters, satisfying conclusions, in a world neatly alphabetized. At 63, I had earned a peaceful existence, knitting in my favorite armchair as sunlight streamed into my living room. Just when I thought life had no more surprises to offer, the world as I knew it collapsed. A news report flashed my only son, Arthur's, face on the screen, tying him to a horrifying scheme of fraud and identity theft used to secure two mortgages. My heart stopped. I thought this was the worst thing that could ever happen, but I was so naive. When I started digging to protect him, I found a secret my late husband had kept. What I discovered made my son's crime seem like a trivial offense compared to the lie he had been living his entire life. My name is Evelyn Corliss. I'm 63, a widow, and a retired librarian, which means I spent 40 years of my life organizing other people's chaos into neat little rolls of Dewey Decimal. You think all that time spent with books, with their tidy beginnings and satisfying endings, would have prepared me for the mess my own life was about to become? You'd be wrong. Dead wrong. But I suppose a life spent among fictional dramas can't quite hold a candle to the real thing, especially when the main villain happens to be your only son. The day it all started was as normal as they come. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one my late husband, Walter, swore was a permanent indentation of my own making. Sunlight streamed through the bay window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. On the ottoman in front of me, a basket overflowed with skeins of yarn in shades of buttercup yellow and baby blue. I was halfway through a blanket I was knitting for the children's ward at the local hospital, an absurdly cheerful patchwork of soft wool. My fingers, a little stiff with arthritis, worked automatically, a quiet, soothing rhythm that had carried me through the lonely years since Walter passed. A small stack of overdue library books sat beside me, a habit I still hadn't managed to break. Yes, it was an entirely predictable, pleasant Tuesday. I had the local news on, a quiet murmur I found more comforting than the silence. The television was on a low volume, just enough to catch a word or two as I worked. I was listening with half an ear to a story about a new park when the screen changed. My eyes, which had been fixed on the intricate pattern of my stitches, flickered up to the television. The image on the screen was a police cruiser parked in front of a sprawling, ugly brick house. A reporter, a young woman with a face full of earnest concentration, was talking. Then they showed a photo, a headshot to be precise. A grainy, slightly unflattering photo. It took a full second for my brain to process what I was seeing, for the fuzzy image to sharpen into a horrific, undeniable clarity. It was my son, my Arthur. The reporter was speaking, her voice a rapid-fire string of words, as police continue their investigation into an elaborate identity theft ring that has targeted multiple elderly residents across the state. My hands, which just a moment before had been so sure and steady, froze. The knitting needle slipped from my grasp and clattered to the hardwood floor with a sharp, tiny sound that felt like a gunshot in the sudden, deafening silence. The words on the screen were a blurry, nonsensical jumble, but the photo of Arthur was shockingly clear. He looked different. Maybe older. A little harder around the edges than the kind, gentle boy I had raised. He was wearing a dark suit, his expression unreadable. But it was him. It was my son. The reporter continued. Authorities allege that the individual, Arthur Corliss, age 37, used stolen identities to secure mortgages on at least two residential properties in the affluent area of Northbrook. The blood rushed from my head. Arthur, my son. Identity theft? Two mortgages? It was an impossibility. It had to be a mistake. A terrible, cruel joke. Arthur was a good boy. He was a loving husband to Bethany and a wonderful father to my two beautiful grandchildren. He had a perfectly respectable job in sales. He was a good person. He couldn't. The television continued its terrible broadcast, showing another photo, this time of a stunningly modern home with huge windows and a perfectly manicured lawn. the kind of place you only see on television shows about millionaires. The reporter said something about the second property, a duplex, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear anything but the deafening roar in my own ears. I sat there frozen, the unfinished blanket a mockery of my pleasant afternoon. I wanted to believe it was a case of mistaken identity, but the face on the screen, the name, it was him. It was my son. And the fact that they were showing this on the news for everyone to see meant that it was serious. So serious that they were making it a public spectacle. My boy. My Arthur. I felt a cold knot of dread form in the pit of my stomach. It was a physical thing, a heavy weight that made it hard to breathe. The shame of it, the horror of it, was a physical blow. To have your son's face plastered on the evening news, accused of a terrible crime, it's a pain that is unlike anything else. I wanted to hide, to cover my face and pretend I hadn't seen it, but the image was burned in my mind. I have to tell you, if you're as shocked as I am right now, you're going to want to stick around to see how this all unfolds. You won't believe the rest of this story, and if you want to make sure you don't miss a single thing, please do me a favor and subscribe to our channel. New videos come out every single day, so you won't have to wait long to get the full story. The remote was on the table beside my knitting basket, a tiny island of plastic in a sea of yarn and half-finished projects. It might as well have been 100 miles away. My hand, still trembling, reached for it. It missed the first time, fumbling, before finally landing on the power button. The screen went black, and the awful, buzzing silence returned. It was better than the image of my son's face being tied to a criminal investigation, but not by much. The reality of it, unmediated by a television screen, felt even more brutal. My knees felt weak, and I sank into the armchair, my body feeling 100 years old. My first thought, a desperate, panicked reflex, was to call him, to call Arthur and demand an explanation, to hear his voice, his own gentle, calm voice, tell me that it was all a terrible mistake. I grabbed my cell phone from the side table, my fingers fumbling with the screen. His name, Arthur, was a bright spot of hope and normalcy on the screen. I pressed it, and it rang once, twice, a third time. My heart was pounding like a drum in my chest. Then his voice, brisk and professional, answered, "Hello, Mom. Is everything all right? I'm kind of in the middle of a meeting." His voice was so normal, so him. A wave of immense relief washed over me, so strong it was almost dizzying. It had to be a mistake. It had to be. "Arthur," I said, my voice shaky, Are you okay? I just saw on the news." He let out a little sigh, a familiar sound of polite impatience. "Mom, what is it? I told you I'm busy. Can this wait?" His evasion was subtle, but it was there, like a ghost in the room. It was so unlike him. The Arthur I knew would have immediately asked what was wrong, what had upset me. This was a stranger, a cold, distant version of my boy. "No, honey, it can't," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I just saw your picture on the news. They said you were involved in an identity theft ring and mortgages on 2 homes." The line went quiet for a moment. Not a natural pause. A deep, heavy, unnatural silence. The kind that makes you want to scream. Then he laughed. A short, sharp, humorless sound. "Mom, that's ridiculous. It's a case of mistaken identity. Happens all the time. Some guy with a similar name, I guess." He sounded so sure, so unconcerned. The rational part of my brain, the librarian part, wanted to believe him. But the mother part, the part that knew every nuance of his voice, was screaming. "Arthur, it was your picture and your name, Arthur Corliss, from here." The desperation must have been clear in my voice. He sighed again, a bit louder this time. "Mom, I swear it's nothing.
A friend of mine in a business deal. It's complicated. It's been resolved. It's just a misunderstanding. But why were you on the news? Why were they showing your picture? And what about the identity theft? He didn't answer my questions. He just spoke over me, his voice a condescending drone. Look, I have to go. Everything is fine. I'm fine. Just don't worry about it, okay? It's not what it looks like. I'll call you later. And then, before I could say another word, he hung up. The line went dead. I sat there holding the cold phone, my mind spinning. A business deal? A friend? It wasn't a denial. It was a deflection, a blatant lie. I felt a cold dread settle over me, a chilling realization that he hadn't denied the accusation at all. He had just tried to brush it away, to make me doubt my own sanity. My eyes drifted to the credenza, where a small stack of our family photos sat in frames. There was one of Arthur at his high school graduation, his face shining with an innocent pride. There was another of him and Bethany, smiling on their wedding day, and one of him holding my first grandchild, a look of pure, unadulterated love in his eyes. Was that all a lie? Was the person in the photos an illusion? The thought was so terrifying, so deeply unsettling that it felt like my very foundation was crumbling. I stood up and walked to my desk, my mind racing. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And it had nothing to do with a business deal. It had to do with me. As I sat down, my eyes fell on a pile of mail I hadn't gotten around to sorting. A few envelopes from the bank. I hadn't opened them yet, a habit I'd picked up since Walter passed away. I trusted the bank. I trusted the system. I thought everything was being handled automatically, but now, with a cold pit in my stomach, I knew I had to check. I tore open the first envelope. It was a bank statement. My eyes scanned the lines of numbers, and then I saw it. A line that read, ACH withdrawal, Walter Vance Trust, a large sum of money, taken out just a few days ago. My heart stopped. My late husband's trust, the one he had set up to ensure my comfort and security for the rest of my life. He hadn't told me about it. He had always been so private about finances. But the money was gone, and I had a feeling I knew where it had gone. I thought I had been shocked before. I was wrong. The image on the news, the cold denial, the missing money, all of it was a single, devastating blow. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew this much. The identity theft wasn't the worst part. This was just the beginning.
My hand holding the bank statement with its single, damning line of numbers felt as if it had turned to stone. ACH withdrawal. Walter Vance Trust. The name was like a ghost on the page, a cruel reminder of my late husband and the solemn promise he had made to me. He had spent his life working to ensure my security, to make sure I would never have to be a burden on anyone, especially not my own son. And now the very thing he had worked for was being siphoned away, not by a stranger, but by the one person we both loved more than anything. I stared at the line item, my mind refusing to accept it. Walter's trust. The money was meant for me, for my retirement, for a comfortable, peaceful old age. It was meant to be untouched. But it had been touched. And I had a sickening feeling I knew by whom. I didn't call Arthur back. What was the point? He'd already lied to me once. He had already dismissed my concerns as the panicked ramblings of an old woman. No, this was beyond a phone call. This was an act of betrayal so profound, so cold-blooded, that it shattered my entire perception of him. This wasn't a business deal. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a crime. A deliberate, calculated act. My own son had stolen from me, and I had a growing, terrifying feeling that this was only the beginning. The first thing I did was go through every piece of mail I had let pile up since Walter's passing. Every bank statement, every bill, every piece of junk mail from the credit card companies. I was a librarian for a reason. I was a master of organization. I could find a needle in a haystack if it was cataloged correctly. And this time, the needle I was looking for was the truth. The pile on my desk, once a disorganized mess, was quickly sorted into neat piles: paid, unpaid, junk, and something else. In the pile of something else, I found 2 envelopes from banks I didn't recognize. The names on the return addresses were strange: Crestview Mortgage Group and Harborview Capital. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tore them open, my hands shaking. The contents were even worse than I had imagined. They were legal documents, loan agreements, mortgages. 2 of them. One for a property on Elmwood Drive, the other for a duplex on Willow Lane. I read the documents with a growing sense of horror. The names on the contracts were my own. Evelyn Corliss. My date of birth, my social security number, all of it. It was my name, my identity, but none of it was mine. The signatures were a crude forgery, a sloppy looping scrawl that looked like a 6-year-old's handwriting. They hadn't even tried to make it look real. They had just assumed I wouldn't notice. They had just assumed I would be a passive, helpless victim. And then I saw the amount. The mortgages were for an absurdly high sum, far more than either of those properties could possibly be worth. I felt a cold dread settle in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just about a house. This was about something much bigger, something much uglier. They hadn't just used my identity to buy houses. They had used it to secure loans for an amount so large it was impossible to comprehend. I pulled out my own checkbook, my hands trembling. The money my husband had left me was gone, and I had a feeling this was only the first chapter of this terrible story. I was a librarian, not a private investigator. My life had been about quiet contemplation, about the gentle hum of a fluorescent light, about the comforting scent of old paper. But now my life had been turned into a crime scene. And I, a 63-year-old woman with a mild case of arthritis and a penchant for knitting, was the prime witness. The irony of it was so thick, it was almost suffocating. The world I had known, a world of logic and reason, had been replaced by a chaotic, horrifying reality. And I, Evelyn Corliss, was caught in the middle. I knew my next step. I had to find out where the money had gone. I had to find out why. The properties were a start. The names of the banks were another. I was going to follow every lead, every thread, every clue. I was going to use every bit of my librarian skill to solve this mystery. My son, my own son, had done this to me. He had violated my trust, my safety, my very identity. And for what? 2 houses? A lifestyle he couldn't afford? It didn't make sense. It was all a tangled, nonsensical mess, a narrative that had no beginning and no end. But I was going to find one, and when I did, I was going to make him pay. This was not just about the money anymore. This was about something much more personal. This was about my life, and I was going to get it back. I had a terrible feeling that the identity theft was just the tip of the iceberg. I had no idea what I was about to find out, but I knew it was going to be much, much worse. The first lie was devastating. The second was a betrayal. I had a feeling the third was going to be a complete and utter annihilation. I sat in my car outside the house on Elmwood Drive, a sleek, modernist monstrosity that looked as out of place in this quiet suburb as a spaceship. The address was printed on the mortgage document I held in my shaking hand. I had driven here, a 63-year-old woman in my sensible sedan, a far cry from the sleek European luxury cars I saw zipping in and out of the driveways. The sheer audacity of it all was breathtaking. They had used my identity, my good name, and my husband's legacy to buy a house that looked like it belonged to a tech mogul. The windows were immense, reflecting the angry gray sky. The lawn was a manicured putting green. A small, ugly sculpture of what looked like a metal bird with a perpetually pained expression sat on a pedestal by the front door. It felt cold, impersonal, and utterly unlike my son. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest. I had spent the entire morning trying to find some logical explanation, some sign that this was a mistake. But every document I found, every piece of mail I opened, confirmed my worst fears. There were credit card statements in my name for furniture stores, high-end electronics, and even a ridiculously expensive trip to Bali. The sheer volume of it was staggering. They hadn't just used my identity to buy houses. They had used it to fund a lifestyle, a lavish, grotesque, and completely unearned lifestyle. And they had done it all while I was at home knitting blankets for children. The irony was so vile I wanted to laugh or scream. I wasn't sure which. I took a deep breath, clutching the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My first instinct was to go back home to pretend I had never seen any of this. But I couldn't. I was a librarian, a keeper of order. My whole life had been about making sense of the chaos. And this was the most profound chaos I had ever seen. I had to know why. I had to look them in the eye and demand the truth. I got out of the car, my legs feeling unsteady, and walked up the pristine driveway. I pressed the cold metal button of the intercom, and my stomach knotted. "Yes?" a tinny voice asked. It was Bethany. "It's Evelyn," I said, my voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause, a heavy silence that stretched for an eternity, then a loud click, and the massive, heavy front door swung open. Bethany stood there, her face a mask of shock and annoyance. She was wearing a silk robe, and her hair was perfectly coiffed. She looked more like a celebrity than my son's wife. "Evelyn," she said, the word a clipped, sharp sound. "What are you doing here?" Her eyes darted from my face to my car and back to the front of the house. She was assessing the situation, calculating the damage. "I think you know, Bethany. I got a letter from the bank, and I saw the news, and I'd like an explanation. Perhaps a truthful one this time." Just then, Arthur walked into the foyer, his face a perfect picture of a man who has just been caught. He was wearing an expensive-looking silk pajama set, and he held a steaming cup of coffee. He looked at me, then at Bethany, and a look of pure panic flashed in his eyes. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he stammered, his bravado gone. "I'm looking for the son who said he was in a business deal, but was actually committing fraud. He must have gotten lost somewhere between here and the police station." Bethany let out a short, hysterical laugh. "It was just a temporary solution, Evelyn. We were going to fix it. We just needed a bit of a bridge, and your credit was so pristine. It was a perfect fit." The audacity of her words was a physical blow. She was talking about my good name, my reputation, my husband's legacy, as if it were a cheap tool to be used and discarded. Arthur just stood there, his face pale, unable to meet my gaze. "Mom, please, let's not make a scene. We can talk about this later." "Later?"
I said, my voice rising. Later? You stole my life, Arthur? You took my name, you took my money, you took the one thing my father gave me, and you want to talk about it later? No, we're talking about it now. All of it. Bethany finally had enough. She stepped forward, her face a furious mask. Look, Evelyn, we're not going to stand here and listen to this. You don't understand what it's like. We had to do this for our business, for our future, for the kids. My eyes fell on the wall behind them, where a small framed photo sat on a mantelpiece. It was a photo of me, Arthur, and Walter, taken years ago. Walter's face, so full of life and love, was smiling. But the photo was cracked. A spider web of cracks stretched across Walter's face. My heart gave a painful lurch. It was a symbolic gesture, a small, cruel sign of what they thought of Walter, of his legacy, of his memory. They had broken him, just as they had broken my trust. I thought I had seen the worst of it, the betrayal, the lies, the theft. But what I was about to find out would shatter my world in a way I never thought possible.
I drove home from my son's new house in a daze. The ride, which should have been a triumphant return, was instead a slow, painful journey through a landscape of broken promises and lies. The image of that cracked photo of Walter was seared into my brain. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate act of contempt, a small, ugly monument to the fact that they felt Walter's legacy was something to be broken, something to be discarded. My husband, the kindest man I had ever known, had been reduced to a piece of decor in a house bought with stolen money. The thought was so vile, so utterly repulsive that I had to pull over to the side of the road, the world spinning around me. I sat there for a long time, the engine humming a quiet, mournful tune. I thought about Walter, his quiet strength, his unwavering decency. He was a man who believed in hard work and honest living. He was the most dependable man I had ever known, a solid rock in a chaotic world. And now his memory was being desecrated by his own son? A wave of a new kind of grief washed over me. It wasn't the grief of loss. It was the grief of a shattered illusion. The man I had raised, the man I had loved, was a stranger, a common thief. The man he had become was an insult to the memory of his father. I finally pulled into my own driveway, my little two-story house, a cozy, familiar space that suddenly felt like a foreign land. I walked through the door, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I went to the kitchen and sat at the table. The silence was deafening. I felt completely, utterly alone. A lifetime of quiet dignity had been replaced by a sickening public shame. The news report, the lies, the stolen money, the cracked photo, it was all too much. And then something occurred to me. A memory from my conversation with Arthur a few weeks ago, before any of this had started. He had mentioned something about a project, something about how he was helping with something his father had left unfinished. At the time, I hadn't paid any attention. I had assumed it was a work project, a business deal. But now the words came back to me, taking on a new, sinister meaning. What had Walter left unfinished? What project was so big that it required a two-house identity theft scheme to complete? My mind went back to the old mahogany desk in the den, Walter's desk. It was where he had spent the last years of his life, tinkering with old models, reading history books, and puttering with the quiet business of being a retired man. I had left it exactly as he had left it, a small shrine to the man he was. I had never gone through the drawers. It felt like an invasion of his privacy, but now, with the cold certainty that this was my only chance to find out the truth, I knew I had to do. I walked into the den, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The room smelled of old books and dust, a comforting, familiar scent that now felt strange and foreign. I sat down in Walter's old armchair. It was still a permanent indentation of a man I loved more than life itself. I began to open the drawers, one by one. The first was full of old pens and pencils. The second, stacks of old bills, all neatly paid and filed. The third, a pile of sentimental odds and ends, a dried flower from our wedding, a baby tooth from Arthur, a faded photograph of me and Walter in our youth. The last drawer was locked. It was a small, inconspicuous drawer tucked away at the bottom. My heart gave a painful lurch. Walter had no secrets. He had never had any secrets. We were a team. We were partners. The locked drawer was a betrayal in and of itself. I rummaged through the drawers looking for a key. I found nothing. I finally gave up and went to the garage where Walter had kept all his tools. I found a small crowbar and brought it back to the desk. With a single sharp motion, I pried open the locked drawer. It opened with a loud protesting creak. Inside, there was a small, dusty envelope. It was marked with a single handwritten word, Arthur. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry, just a single piece of paper, a letter, and a key. The key was for a safe deposit box at a bank downtown. The letter, though, was what made the air leave my lungs. It was from Walter. It was addressed to me, but it was for Arthur. My hand shook as I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was his. The words were his. I began to read, my mind a frantic, horrified mess. The words were a quiet, devastating confession. It was about something from his past, something he had done, a secret he had kept for 40 years. It wasn't a criminal act, not in the sense of the law, but it was a moral one. He had made a terrible mistake, and he had spent his entire life trying to fix it, and it was all tied to Arthur. The money, the mortgages, the identity theft, it was all connected to this one terrible secret from his past. I had a feeling the identity theft was just the symptom of a much, much sicker disease. And the disease was the secret my husband had kept from me for 40 years, the secret he had entrusted to our son. I stood there, the letter in my hands, and felt the ground open up beneath me. I thought my son's betrayal was the worst part. I was wrong. The worst part was that it had all started with my husband, the man I trusted more than anything in the world, the man I thought I had known, the man I had just realized had been a stranger all along.
The key to the safe deposit box was cold in my hand as I walked into the downtown bank. The air was sterile, the lighting too bright, and the teller behind the counter gave me a polite, practiced smile. I felt like I was in a movie, a low-budget, terrible movie about a woman in a thriller. I had left the letter from Walter on my kitchen table, afraid to bring it with me, afraid to let its terrible truths leave the confines of my home. But the key was a physical thing, a small piece of metal that held the key to a truth that was about to shatter my world. I handed it to the teller, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She led me to a small, private room, a sterile, windowless space that smelled of money and old paper. The walls were a pale, institutional gray. The door shut behind me, and the click of the lock was a final, terrible sound. She placed a small metal box on the table in front of me. This was it, the moment of truth.
I took a deep breath, my hands shaking, and opened the box. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry. There was just a thick, leather-bound folder. It was old, the leather cracked and worn. I opened it with a sense of dread. Inside, there were documents, a series of them, all dating back decades. They were all about a company I had never heard of, Atlas Financial. It was a small investment firm that had gone belly up in the late 90s, and the documents detailed the entire tragic story. They were about my husband, my Walter. He had been a small-time investor, a quiet, unassuming man who had put his life savings into a company that promised him a fortune. It was a Ponzi scheme, one of the first, and it had collapsed, taking with it the life savings of hundreds of people. Walter hadn't been an investor. He had been a partner. He hadn't just lost money. He had been an active participant, a trusted source, a man who had convinced his friends, his family, and even some of our own neighbors to invest in a company that turned out to be a fraud. I sat there staring at the documents, my mind a blank white canvas. It was a lie. It was a terrible, beautiful lie. The man I had known, the man I had trusted, the man who had been the very foundation of my life was a stranger. He had spent his entire life, our entire life, building a facade. He had worked to pay off the debts, to pay back the people he had wronged, but he had never told me. He had never told me the truth. The man who had been my rock was a con man. The shame of it, the betrayal of it was a physical blow. The identity theft, the mortgages, the lies, it all made sense now. The mortgages weren't for Arthur's lavish lifestyle. They were for Walter's secret. They were a last-ditch effort to pay off the final remaining debts, the ones Walter had never been able to get rid of, the ones he had left to our son. I stood up, the room spinning around me. I felt as if I were in a dream, a terrible, horrifying dream. I felt betrayed, not by my son, but by my husband, by the man I had loved and trusted for 40 years. I had thought my son's betrayal was the worst thing in the world. I was wrong. This was the worst thing, the betrayal of a lifetime. The man I had loved was a fraud, a thief, a liar. He had stolen from me, from our family, from our life, and he had used our own son to clean up his mess. The thought was so vile, so utterly repulsive that I wanted to scream. I walked out of the bank, the box clutched in my hands, a tangible, horrifying testament to a lifetime of lies. I didn't go home. I went to a park. I sat on a bench, the world a hazy, blurred mess around me. I finally took out my phone. I didn't call Arthur to demand an explanation. I called him to give him one. "Arthur," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I know." The line was silent for a moment. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to lie. He just said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. He told me he had a secret. He told me he had a debt. He told me he was trying to protect you from the shame. He told me he was sorry. He told me I had to do this. He told me it was my duty." My heart, which had been a cold, hard stone for weeks, finally broke. My son wasn't a thief. He was a fool, a misguided, pathetic fool who had been so desperate to please his father, to be the hero, that he had become the villain. He had been blind, so desperate for his father's love that he had become a pawn in a game he didn't even understand. The worst part of the story wasn't the identity theft. It wasn't the mortgages. It wasn't even the lies. It was the realization that my son, the boy I had raised with such love and pride, had been sacrificed to his father's lie. And I had been a stranger to my own life. It had all been an illusion. And now the illusion was gone, and I had to find a way to live in the real world, a world that was far more complicated and far more terrible than I had ever imagined.
The world looked different now. The betrayal wasn't a sudden, sharp pain. It was a dull ache, a constant, low-level thrum of sadness that settled in the pit of my stomach and refused to leave. I had spent a lifetime building a sanctuary, a life built on trust and love. I had believed in the honest goodness of my husband, Walter. I had believed in the gentle heart of my son, Arthur. And in a single, terrible afternoon, I had discovered that it had all been a lie, a beautiful, carefully constructed lie that had crumbled into dust the moment I had pried open that locked drawer. The identity theft, the mortgages, the lies, it was all just a symptom of a much, much sicker disease. And the disease was the secret my husband had kept from me for 40 years. I spent the next few days in a fog, walking through my home like a ghost. I looked at our wedding photos, at the faded image of a smiling, confident Walter, and felt a cold, hard knot of rage. He had lied to me. He had used me. He had spent his entire life building a wall of secrecy around our life, and he had used our own son as a pawn to protect it. Arthur wasn't a thief. He was a fool, a misguided, pathetic fool who had been so desperate for his father's approval, so desperate to be the hero, that he had become the villain. The thought was so vile, so utterly repulsive that I wanted to scream. I felt a terrible sense of isolation. I had no one to turn to. I couldn't call a lawyer. What would I say? My husband was a fraud, and my son is a criminal. They would lock me up in a mental institution. I couldn't go to the police. I couldn't betray my own son. The thought of seeing him in a jail cell, of seeing his face on the news again, no, I couldn't do it. And so I made a decision. A terrible, wonderful decision. I was going to fix it. I was going to clean up my husband's mess, and I was going to save my son from himself. This was no longer just about me. This was about restoring order to the chaos. This was about righting the wrongs of a lifetime. This was about my family, and I was going to do it all myself. My first step was to find out everything I could about the two mortgages, the names of the banks, the addresses, the amounts. I spent hours on the phone, a small, polite, and very persistent woman with a voice like a steel trap. The bank tellers, the customer service representatives, the mortgage brokers, they were all so polite. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but we can't give out any information." I would simply smile and say, "I understand, but I have a feeling that if you don't, your superiors will be very interested in the fact that you allowed a fraudulent mortgage to go through." The threat was unspoken, but it was there, and it was enough. I got the names of the mortgage brokers, the lawyers, the appraisers. I was a librarian for a reason. I was a master of organization. I could find a needle in a haystack if it was cataloged correctly, and this time the needle I was looking for was the truth. The truth was a sordid, ugly thing. The mortgages weren't just for houses. They were for a Ponzi scheme that my husband had been a part of in the 90s, a terrible, ugly crime that he had spent his entire life trying to fix, and he had left the last remaining debts to our son. Arthur, in his misguided effort to fix his father's mess, had used my identity to secure the final loans. It was a tragic, horrifying story, and I was the one who was going to write the ending. I made a phone call, not to a lawyer, not to a friend. I called the main office of one of the mortgage companies listed on the documents. I asked for the head of the legal department. The secretary was polite
but firm. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but he's in a meeting." I smiled, a cold, hard smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Tell him that Evelyn Corliss is on the line. I have a feeling he'll want to talk to me." The threat was unspoken, but it was there, and it was enough. The phone went silent for a moment. Then a voice, a calm, professional, and very nervous voice came on the line. "Mrs. Corliss, how can I help you?" I took a deep breath. "I think you know," I said. "I'm calling about the 2 mortgages you issued in my name, the ones you issued without my consent." The line was silent for a moment. "Mrs. Corliss, I don't know what you're talking about." I smiled, a cold, hard smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I think you do. I have a copy of the loan documents, the forged signatures, and the names of the 2 brokers who handled the loan. I have a feeling that your company will be very interested in a visit from the FBI." The threat was a tangible, physical thing, and it was enough. The man on the other end of the line stammered. "Mrs. Corliss, please, let's not be hasty. We can talk about this. We can work something out." "We can, but we're going to do it my way, and we're going to do it right now." The silence on the other end of the line was a silent but very real surrender. I was not a woman in a thriller. I was a 63-year-old woman with a mild case of arthritis and a penchant for knitting, and I was about to go to war. I was going to win, and when I was done, no one was going to mess with me again. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and I was going to make sure they found out. I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side of that conversation. I thought my family secrets were the worst of it, but I was about to find out that there were other people in the world who were just as lost and just as dangerous as my son. I had no idea what was coming, and I was about to find out.
The meeting with the legal team was exactly what I had expected. A room full of expensive suits and nervous energy. The head of the legal department, a slick man with a perpetually furrowed brow, tried to be firm, but his eyes betrayed a deep, abiding panic. "Mrs. Corliss," he began, his voice a low, smooth drone, "we are prepared to settle this matter discreetly." I simply smiled, a cold, hard smile that didn't reach my eyes. "There is nothing discreet about my son's face on the evening news," I said, my voice as calm as a summer day. "And there is certainly nothing discreet about my forged signature on 2 separate mortgage documents. I want answers, and I have a feeling that if you don't give them to me, the FBI will be very, very interested in your answers." The man went pale. He knew. They all knew. They had been involved in this sordid little scheme, and they had just been caught. They had thought I was a helpless old woman. They had thought I would just go away. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I was a 63-year-old retired librarian. I knew how to find a needle in a haystack. And this time, the haystack was filled with a million little needles of deceit. "Mrs. Corliss," he said, his voice a little shaky, "we can explain everything. We just need to speak with you privately." I simply smiled. "We are private. The truth, gentlemen, is a very private thing." He motioned to the other lawyers in the room, and they all left, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and shame. He sat down across from me, his eyes full of resigned dread. "What do you want, Mrs. Corliss?" he asked, his voice low and defeated. "I want the truth," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "I want to know where the money went. The mortgages, they were for an absurdly high sum. What was the money for?" He sighed, a deep, heavy sound. "It was for a series of settlements, a debt that was long-standing." "What kind of debt?" I asked, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He hesitated. "It was
A legacy debt. A debt from a Ponzi scheme that your late husband was involved in. He had been paying it off for years, but he had a few remaining debts. And your son, he tried to pay them off. He thought he was helping. He thought he was protecting your honor. The world, which had been a clear, logical place just a moment before, suddenly went blurry. My husband's legacy, a Ponzi scheme, a debt that had followed us for 40 years. It all made sense now. The sleepless nights, the little secrets, the way he would go to bed with a book but never read it. He had been a man haunted by a ghost from his past, and he had used his own son to clean up his mess. I felt a wave of a new kind of grief, not just for the man I had lost, but for the man I had never known, the man who had lived his life in the shadow of a lie, the man who had been a thief, the man who had turned our son into a criminal. "What about the duplex?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "The one on Willow Lane. The document said it was for a series of settlements. What kind of settlements?" He hesitated, his eyes full of a strange, nervous dread. "It was a legacy debt. A debt from a Ponzi scheme that your late husband was involved in. He had been paying it off for years, but he had a few remaining debts. And your son, he tried to pay them off. He thought he was helping. He thought he was protecting your honor." The man paused for a long time. The silence in the room was a living, breathing thing. "Mrs. Corliss," he said, his voice a low, heavy sound. "Your husband, he had a daughter." The world, which had been a clear, logical place just a moment before, suddenly went blurry. My husband's legacy, a Ponzi scheme, a daughter, a second family? The thought was so vile, so utterly repulsive that I wanted to scream. It all made sense now. The mortgages, the identity theft, the lies. It was all a chain reaction of a past I never knew existed. My husband wasn't a hero. He was a fraud. He had stolen from people. He had lived a lie. And he had a daughter, a second family. My son wasn't a thief. He was a fool. A misguided, pathetic fool who had been so desperate to please his father, so desperate to be the hero, that he had become a pawn in a game he didn't even understand. The worst part of the story wasn't the identity theft. It wasn't the mortgages. It wasn't even the lies. It was the realization that my son, the boy I had raised with such love and pride, had been sacrificed to his father's lie, and I had been a stranger to my own life. It had all been an illusion, and now the illusion was gone, and I had to find a way to live in the real world, a world that was far more complicated and far more terrible than I had ever imagined. I thought I knew the worst part. I thought I knew what pain was, but I was about to find out that there was a final secret, one that would shatter my world, and I couldn't wait to find out.
The final piece of the puzzle was the duplex, the one on Willow Lane. The address on the mortgage document was seared into my brain, a constant, low-level thrum of dread. I knew what I would find there. I knew it wasn't just a house. It was a secret that my husband had kept for 40 years, a secret that had consumed my son, and a secret that was about to be revealed to the entire world. I had thought I knew the worst part of the story. I was wrong. The worst part was that it had all started with the man I had loved and trusted more than anything in the world, the man who had been a thief, the man who had a second family, the man who had a daughter. I drove to Willow Lane in a daze, the world a hazy, blurred mess around me. The duplex was a small, unassuming building, a stark contrast to the sprawling, ugly brick house my son had bought with my money. It was a quiet, peaceful place with a small garden in the back and a perfectly manicured lawn. It was a place where a family could live a quiet, unassuming life. It was a place where a secret could be kept for 40 years. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I felt completely, utterly alone. I had no one to turn to. I couldn't call a lawyer. I couldn't go to the police. I couldn't betray my own family. The thought of seeing him in a jail cell, of seeing his face on the news again, no, I couldn't do it. And so I made a decision, a terrible, wonderful decision. I was going to fix it. I was going to clean up my husband's mess, and I was going to save my son from himself. This was no longer just about me. This was about restoring order to the chaos. This was about righting the wrongs of a lifetime. This was about my family, and I was going to do it all myself. My first step was to find out everything I could about the two mortgages, the names of the banks, the addresses, the amounts. I spent hours on the phone. A small, polite, and very persistent woman with a voice like a steel trap. The bank tellers, the customer service representatives, the mortgage brokers, they were all so polite. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't give out any information." I would simply smile and say, "I understand, but I have a feeling that if you don't, your superiors will be very interested in the fact that you allowed a fraudulent mortgage to go through." The threat was unspoken, but it was there, and it was enough. The phone went silent for a moment. Then a voice, a calm, professional, and very nervous voice came on the line. "Mrs. Corliss, how can I help you?" I took a deep breath. "I think you know. I'm calling about the two mortgages you issued in my name, the ones you issued without my consent." The line was silent for a moment. "Mrs. Corliss, I don't know what you're talking about." I smiled, a cold, hard smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I think you do. I have a copy of the loan documents, the forged signatures, and the names of the two brokers who handled the loan. I have a feeling that your company will be very interested in a visit from the FBI." The threat was a tangible, physical thing, and it was enough. The man on the other end of the line stammered, "Mrs. Corliss, please, let's not be hasty. We can talk about this. We can work something out." "We can," I said, my voice as calm as a summer day, "but we're going to do it my way, and we're going to do it right now." The silence on the other end of the line was a silent but very real surrender. I was not a woman in the thriller. I was a 63-year-old woman with a mild case of arthritis and a penchant for knitting, and I was about to go to war. I was going to win, and when I was done, no one was going to mess with me again. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and I was going to make sure they found out. I stood outside the duplex on Willow Lane, the small, unassuming building that held the final piece of the puzzle. My heart, which had been a cold, hard stone for weeks, now felt a strange mixture of dread and a terrible, devastating curiosity. This was it, the final, terrible truth, the place where my husband's secret, his second life, had been hidden for 40 years. I had no idea what to expect. A woman with a broken heart, a woman who had been betrayed by the man she loved more than anything in the world. I took a deep breath, and I walked up to the door. I didn't knock. I just stood there, my hand on the cold metal handle, and I waited. The door opened with a quiet creak. A woman in her late 30s with a tired, kind face, stood there. Her eyes, a beautiful, striking shade of blue, were a mirror of my husband's eyes. My heart gave a painful lurch. It was him. It was my husband. The resemblance was so striking, so undeniable, that it was a physical blow. She looked at me, and her face, a beautiful, kind face, was a mask of confusion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring at her, a stranger who was a part of my family, a part of my husband's lie. "My name is Evelyn," I finally managed, my voice a whisper. "Evelyn Corliss. I'm Arthur's mother." Her eyes widened, and a look of dawning realization,
of fear and dread crossed her face. She knew. She knew who I was. She knew why I was here. I didn't have to say a word. She just knew. She looked at me, and her eyes, a reflection of my husband's, were full of a terrible, heartbreaking sadness. "Please," she said, her voice a low, heavy sound. "Come in." I walked into the duplex, into the small, unassuming home that was a shrine to a life I never knew existed. The walls were covered with photos of a little girl who looked just like my husband, photos of a young woman who looked just like me, photos of a man who looked just like my husband, smiling with a woman who was not me. I looked at the photos, and a terrible, painful truth settled in my heart. This wasn't just a lie. This was a whole life, a whole family, a whole world that I had never known existed. I sat down on a small, uncomfortable sofa, and the woman, a woman I now knew was my husband's daughter, sat across from me. Her name was Sarah. She was a woman with a kind heart and a beautiful soul. She told me the entire story. The story of her mother, a woman my husband had loved, a woman he had left to protect her from the shame of his Ponzi scheme. The story of a father who had been in her life, a father who'd been a quiet, gentle presence, but a father who had been a lie. The story of a man who had tried to right the wrongs of his past, a man who had tried to protect the women he loved, but a man who had ended up destroying everything. I listened to her story, and a terrible, beautiful truth settled in my heart. My husband wasn't a hero. He was a fraud. He had stolen from people. He had lived a lie. And he had a daughter, a second family. My son wasn't a thief. He was a fool. A misguided, pathetic fool who had been so desperate to please his father, so desperate to be the hero, that he had become a pawn in a game he didn't even understand. The worst part of the story wasn't the identity theft. It wasn't the mortgages. It wasn't even the lies. It was the realization that my son, the boy I had raised with such love and pride, had been sacrificed to his father's lie. And I had been a stranger to my own life. It had all been an illusion. And now, the illusion was gone. And I had to find a way to live in the real world, a world that was far more complicated and far more terrible than I had ever imagined. I sat with Sarah for hours and we talked. We talked about Walter. We talked about our lives. We talked about the beautiful, terrible lie that had been our lives. And in that quiet, unassuming room, a new kind of family was born. A family born not of blood, but of truth. A family born not of a lie, but of a broken, beautiful reality. My son and his wife had been so desperate for a new life, they had tried to steal mine. But they had no idea that they'd just given me a new family. A family born of a terrible lie, but a family born of love. I stood up and I hugged Sarah, my new daughter. I looked at her and I saw my husband's eyes, and I knew that the man I had loved was not a stranger. He was a part of her. He was a part of me. He was a part of a beautiful, complicated, and very, very sad story. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew that I had a new family. I knew that I had a new daughter, and I knew that I was finally free. I was free from the lie. I was free from the shame. I was free from the burden of a secret I never knew. And I was finally free to be myself. The woman who had been a librarian, the woman who had been a wife, the woman who had been a mother, and now the woman who was finally free. I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side of that door. I thought my family's secrets were the worst of it, but I was about to find out that there was a final secret, one that would shatter my world. And I couldn't wait to find out.